There are moments in history when the world seems to hold its breath, and the Egypt Peace Summit was just that, a collective sigh between fear and hope. What began as just another political gathering transformed into a global spectacle, where the stage shone brighter than the script. Trump, surrounded by leaders of rival nations, promised an end to conflict and the beginning of a new era. But behind the scenes, the buzz was different. Were they truly seeking peace, or redrawing the map of global power? The images that circulated showed handshakes, flags side by side, and moving speeches. But those who looked closely would perceive something beyond the diplomatic glamour. A hidden tension, a rehearsed choreography between distrust and convenience. Gaza, devastated and exhausted, had become the symbol of a global promise. Rebuild to live, or rebuild to control. The paradox was cruel and fascinating. After all, how many times has humanity called peace what deep down was merely the silence preceding another war? Behind the curtains of the Cairo Palace, more than a political game was being played out. The fate of a generation was being played out. Every speech concealed a strategy, every smile a condition, and every signature a price. The question that has echoed ever since is simple yet disturbing. Did the world witness a historic agreement, or the birth of a new illusion carefully sold as hope? In the days leading up to the Egypt Peace Summit, the world seemed to hold its breath. Gaza lay in ashes, and each explosion echoed as a cruel reminder of how far humanity had strayed from reason itself. The headlines repeated themselves, the speeches contradicted each other, and deep down, a nagging question loomed. For how long? Leaders, analysts, and even ordinary citizens felt that something needed to change. Not just a treaty, but the entire logic that fueled wars. It was as if the entire planet was at a boiling point, waiting for a gesture that could redefine history. In Cairo cafes, people were discussing with disbelief the news that Trump would gather the world's top leaders for a definitive summit. Some laughed, others feared. After all, how many times had the world heard promises of peace that ended in new offensives? But there was something different this time, a mixture of pragmatism and desperation. The political and human cost of war had become unsustainable, and even the most skeptical recognized. Either a new path would emerge, or everyone would collapse together into the abyss of their own arrogance. And it was in this climate of tension and expectation that Egypt became the epicenter of the century's hopes and contradictions. The borders were on high alert, diplomats raced against time, and journalists from every continent crowded before the gates of the presidential palace. Every look, every word, every silence carried weight. The stage was set, and as the cameras prepared, the world awaited the first step of the protagonists who would dare to reshape the future. The planes started landing in Cairo International Airport as messengers of an inevitable fate. Flags of different nations fluttered in the hot desert wind, while armored convoys cruised the avenues with discreet, almost respectful sirens. Egypt, accustomed to being the stage for millennia-old mysteries, now harbored another kind of enigma, that of modern diplomacy. Between restrained smiles and calculated handshakes, each leader carried in their suitcases not only political intentions, but also open wounds, old promises, and fears disguised as confidence. Trump was the first to attract the cameras, stepping off the plane with his characteristic air of someone who has mastered the game before it even begins. Behind him, a robust entourage, strategists, military personnel, and advisors, signaled that the meeting would be anything but symbolic. Across the tarmac, representatives from the European Union, Russia, China, and Arab countries watched with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Each glance seemed to gauge the other's strength, and the simple exchange of greetings already revealed what the official speeches tried to hide. No one was there just for peace, but also for the power that would arise from it. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was electric. Journalists captured snippets of conversation, diplomats exchanged indecipherable glances, and aides whispered in long, chilly corridors. The Cairo Palace had transformed into a human chessboard, where every move, every silence, and every gesture held strategic significance. And when the doors to the main hall closed, the whole world knew the game had begun. And Trump's first words could reset the tone of the entire summit. Trump entered the room with his feet were firm, his gaze sweeping the room like someone measuring the terrain before battle. The silence that accompanied him was almost ceremonial. When he began to speak, his voice echoed off the golden columns with a studied cadence, a mixture of promise and challenge. "The world needs peace, but not a naive peace," he said, gesturing in a controlled manner. Many watched him skeptically, others with curious hope. It was hard to deny that, somehow, he managed to capture the attention of even those most opposed to him. His speech was calculated like a war game disguised as diplomatic poetry. Trump spoke of reconstruction, but also of strength. He cited the suffering of innocent people in Gaza, but spared no criticism of governments that, he said, use peace as a facade to maintain profitable chaos. The cameras captured discreet reactions, raised eyebrows, restrained smiles, quick notes on leather pads. Each sentence seemed crafted to resonate differently in each ear. A call for cooperation for some, a veiled warning for others. And then, amid the rhetoric of hope, he uttered the phrase that would echo across the world's news. "We didn't come to discuss the end of a war. We came to build the beginning of an era." The hall responded with hesitant applause, but the subtext was denser than the sound. There was a sense, hidden between the lines, that this summit wouldn't just be an agreement. It would be a watershed between the diplomacy of the last century and the raw pragmatism of the present. And off-camera, the real power play began. In the luxurious corridors of the palace, far from the cameras and formalities, the real clash began to take shape. As Trump presented his reconstruction vision for Gaza, Russia and China exchanged subtle, almost imperceptible, yet meaningful glances. No words needed to be spoken for everyone to understand. Peace was merely an elegant disguise for a much older dispute: strategic control of the Middle East. The behind-the-scenes conversations were polite, but carried the weight of those who know that the slightest slip-up can cost decades of influence. The United States sought to reassert its presence, not only as a mediator, but as an architect of the new regional order. Russia, for its part, played the game of resistance, offering logistical, humanitarian, and friendly support, but always with an eye on ports and energy corridors. China, meanwhile, remained faithful to its quiet diplomacy, observing, calculating, and discreetly financing whatever was necessary to secure its share of future reconstruction. It was a global chess game, and Gaza, unfortunately, was the board. As leaders took turns delivering polished speeches, aides exchanged dossiers, and intelligence agents mapped emerging alliances, what was being discussed there was not just the future of a territory, but the balance of power in the 21st century. The Peace Summit, sold to the world as a symbol of unity, was transformed piece by piece into a minefield of masked ambitions. And amidst it all, Egypt watched silently, aware that perhaps its role was much greater than it appeared. Egypt, accustomed to being a bridge between chaos and diplomacy softly, he assumed the role of host with the serenity of someone who understands the weight of history. Since the time of the pharaohs, that land had served as a stage for empires, invasions, and unlikely alliances. Now it was once again the center of attention, but with a modern burden, balancing forces that, with any spark, could set the world ablaze. The Egyptian president walked among the delegations with a firm posture but a watchful gaze, every gesture calculated, every word measured. He was a maestro attempting to direct an orchestra of nations playing different scores. Behind the scenes, Egyptian diplomats worked with surgical precision. Their conversations were guided not by idealism, but by pragmatism. Egypt knew that peace in Gaza meant stability within its own borders and international prestige, two valuable currencies in times of global instability. It was common to see advisors from Cairo moving between the Western and Arab blocs, translating not only languages, but also intentions. The country had become a kind of emotional filter between powers that distrusted each other, but also could not negotiate alone. Meanwhile, outside the gilded halls, the Egyptian people watched with a mixture of pride and distrust. The streets teemed with opinions, posters, and cautious hopes. "May their peace cost us no more than their war," a tea vendor told a foreign reporter. A simple phrase, but one that summed up the collective sentiment. Egypt was the temporary guardian of a fragile peace, and any misstep could transform it from mediator to target. Yet there was a sense of destiny in the air, as if the country once again had been chosen to test the human capacity to rebuild the impossible. As the doors to the main hall closed, the air seemed to change density. The cameras were turned off, the microphones silenced, and the public spectacle gave way to the true theater of diplomacy. Inside, away from the flashbulbs and rehearsed rhetoric, the voices grew quieter but infinitely more dangerous. Trump leaned over the table, flanked by advisors, while Russian and Chinese delegates exchanged rapid notes. Every word spoken was a gamble, every pause a tactic. The atmosphere was so dense that even the interpreters breathed cautiously, fearing to translate what shouldn't be heard. There were moments when the tone rose. Discussions about borders, humanitarian corridors, and control of Mediterranean trade routes turned the meeting into a verbal minefield. Trump insisted on guaranteeing security and economic autonomy for Gaza, but the subtext was clear: direct American influence over reconstruction. Russia countered, citing sovereignty and multipolar balance, while China proposed a global reconstruction committee, an idea that sounded generous but concealed a vast project of financial dominance. Egypt, in the midst of the turmoil, acted as a translator of reason, trying to contain the storm with diplomatic smiles and vague promises. The official notes would never record everything that was said. Some agreements were sealed with glances, others with silence. Rumors abounded that side deals were being hammered out in smaller rooms among trusted aides. No one left without taking something, or leaving something behind. And when the doors finally opened, faces were serene, but eyes betrayed weariness and calculation. Outside, journalists waited for statements. Inside, the world had just changed, even if no one knew exactly how. The document was announced as Gaza Reconstruction and Security Agreement, but between the elegant lines and solemn signatures, there was much more than words. Written in neutral language, it seemed to promise the impossible: a permanent ceasefire, humanitarian corridors, and a trilateral economic plan between the U.S., Egypt, and Arab allies. However, for those familiar with the vocabulary of diplomacy, the terms strategic monitoring and supervised international cooperation sounded like euphemisms for control. Peace, after all, rarely comes without a price. Trump presented the document with the confidence of a negotiator who knows that the stage is as important as the content. He spoke of hope, reconstruction, and a new beginning for the Middle East, but one only had to read carefully to see the fine print. The plan called for a temporary joint military presence, foreign companies managing the reconstruction, and clauses favoring Western investors. It was a peace with an instruction manual, and whoever wrote it also decided the rules of the future. Many applauded. Others simply stood idly by, aware that modern wars are rarely fought with weapons, but with contracts. Still, the world reacted as if witnessing an unlikely miracle. Images of the signing circulated around the planet. Outstretched hands, united flags, renewed promises. But a closer look revealed the shadows behind the smiles. The document represented both a historic step and a new form of dependence masquerading as partnership. And while the leaders celebrated in front of the cameras, diplomats behind the scenes were already discussing the question no one dared ask in public: how long would this peace last? Reactions to the agreement were immediate and intense, spreading across the world like ripples after a silent explosion. In Washington, Trump's allies hailed it as the greatest diplomatic feat of the century, while critics accused him of theatricalizing peace to mask geopolitical ambitions. In Europe, the news divided opinion. Some leaders saw the Egypt summit as a glimmer of stability in dark times. Others feared the document was merely a new model of economic colonialism, disguised as humanitarian aid. On social media, debate raged between hashtags of hope and theories of global manipulation. In the Middle East, the response was even more complex. Israel received the agreement cautiously, wary of its clauses on international monitoring. Palestinian groups celebrated the ceasefire but denounced the lack of a real voice in the negotiations. Turkey openly criticized the foreign military presence, while Iran called the treaty the peace of the strong on the rubble of the weak. Each statement seemed like a piece in a contradictory mosaic, where no one knew for sure whether peace was the beginning of a new era or merely a pause before another tragedy. At the UN, the tone was one of restrained optimism. Speeches extolled the historic breakthrough, but one only had to look behind the scenes to sense the unease. Veteran diplomats exchanged silent glances, recalling other summits, other agreements, other promises that had disintegrated in the face of reality. The world once again applauded the spectacle of conciliation, while discreetly preparing for the next chapter. After all, in global politics, the line between hope and disillusionment is always too thin to be reliable. In Gaza, the dawn after the accordo was unlike any other. For the first time in months, the predominant sound was not sirens, but children running through the rubble with makeshift kites. Families returned to the streets, merchants cautiously opened their shops, and mosque loudspeakers echoed prayers of gratitude and uncertainty. There were tears and smiles mingled, as if the entire city was taking a deep breath after a long swim. But beneath the timid glow of hope, a silent fear lingered. The fear that it was all too temporary. Troops began to slowly withdraw, and humanitarian aid convoys crossed the borders escorted by international vehicles. Foreign doctors mingled with local volunteers, and the press captured images that moved the world. Still, amid the tents and ruins, the question lingered. Who was really in charge of this reconstruction? Many residents said that true peace would only come when they could decide their own fate, without intermediaries or outside contracts. The feeling was one of relief, but also of vigilance. No one in Gaza fully believed in promises, not after so many that ended in dust. As the news broadcasts showed scenes of reunions and white flags, the elders watched in silence, like those who had seen this film before. They knew that war never ends with signatures alone. It slowly dissolves into the invisible details of everyday life. And even though the sound of gunfire had ceased, the rumble of distrust still echoed in their minds and hearts. Gaza was at peace, at least for now. But time would tell if this truce would be a new beginning, or just a break between two chapters of the same story. The future, after the summit of Egypt, seemed like a misty horizon, visible enough to inspire hope, yet obscure enough to generate fear. While leaders spoke of a new era and lasting reconstruction, military strategists, economists, and political analysts drew up scenarios ranging from rebirth to collapse. The peace, signed on paper, now depended on human hands, and human hands, as history has proven countless times, are fragile in the face of greed. There were those who believed in a genuine new beginning, but also those who saw it merely as a convenient pause before the next big explosion. The signatory countries began to move with suspicious speed. International companies landed with million-dollar contracts, while local groups questioned who was truly profiting from the reconstruction. In the political underground, new alliances were forming, discreetly, almost imperceptibly. It was the harbinger of a new kind of conflict, one that used influence rather than bombs. Trump spoke of a historical legacy, but his critics said the real battlefield was now economic. Gaza had become not just a territory, but a laboratory for the future. And amidst the ruins and the speeches, humanity watched itself repeat old patterns under a new guise. The long-awaited peace proved as fragile as the paper that held it together. Yet one thing remained undeniable. The world had changed, and even if the next war lurked, no one could claim ignorance of what was to come. The gears were already turning, silently preparing the ground for the next chapter in global history. History repeats itself, but rarely in the same way. Today, wars don't just start with bombs. They start with speeches, with agreements that seem too peaceful, with rehearsed smiles and promises that sound too sweet to be true. What we saw at the Egypt Peace Summit may have been a milestone or a warning. The truth is, before the first shot is fired, the world always gives signals, and almost no one pays attention. Can you recognize them? Can you tell when the silence is just the calm before the storm? Every troop movement, every economic fluctuation, every speech in the name of peace may hide something much bigger, something few see, but which changes the course of history. What's happening in Gaza, the Middle East, and at the summits of power is just the beginning of a new era of invisible conflicts, where information is the most lethal weapon. If you want to understand what is really behind these events and learn to identify when a war is about to start, get the ebook now 10 Signs that a war is about to start. It will open your eyes to patterns the news doesn't show, and perhaps make you realize that the future of the world has already begun to be decided, even before we know it.